Hi everyone. For today's lesson, we are looking at the Dark Romantics. We are looking at Nathaniel Hawthorne and his story, The Birthmark. And in doing that, we're going to be answering and thinking about the essential question about the influence that an historical period can have on a style of writing that an author chooses. And we have already been talking about that when we looked back into Unit 1 at the early American narrative and how people chose to write in journal. And we talked about that as we looked at American mythology and the American Renaissance and looked at that historical period of time and how it would influence not only what a writer writes about, but how they choose to write it. So today we're going to be looking at the background of Nathaniel Hawthorne. We're going to talk about dark romanticism and talk about it in relationship to transcendentalism. And then you'll be reading a story called The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So who was Nathaniel Hawthorne? He was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts. He had a constant sense of guilt for his great-grandfather for being a judge at the Salem witch trials. Now, you know, if you've learned about that yet, that the Salem witch trials were where women were, and even young women, were considered witches, and then they were burned at the stake or they were exiled. And so his grandfather was a part of this, and he felt guilty because these women obviously had done nothing wrong and they were not witches. So he felt guilty that his grandfather had been a part of this, and he wrote these Gothic stories during the Romanticism period of American literature. He was friends with Herman Melville. He wrote Moby Dick, Billy Budd, if you've ever read any of those. And Hawthorne's most notable works are The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables. Scarlet Letter is an awesome book. So if you like The Birthmark and you want to read more Nathaniel Hawthorne, I would definitely suggest that you check that out. So who were these dark romantics? Well, they were a group of 19th century writers who explored the dark side of human nature. Sounds a little creepy. Dark romantic writers explored the human potential for evil, including the psychological effects of guilt and sin and madness. I can't help but think of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. It kind of did all of those things. The dark romantic view countered the optimism of the transcendentalist writers at the time. And we think about the transcendentalists and how they thought everyone was good, and they saw nature as this divine thing that they would just go, and they would go and have these spiritual experiences. And the dark romantics are taking an opposite view. So what are some of those differences between the transcendentalists and the dark romantics? Well, the transcendentalists, like we just said, saw divine goodness and beauty beneath everyday reality. They embraced the mystical and idealist elements of Puritan thought. But the dark romantics believed spiritual truths could be ugly and frightening. And they reintroduced the dark side of those Puritan beliefs, which in part led a lot to the Salem witch trials. It's the idea of original sin and the human potential for evil. Sorry, guys, it got hung up there for just a second. So some similarities, though. There were some similarities between the transcendentalists and the dark romantics. True reality is spiritual. They both believed that. They also believe that intuition is superior to logic and reason. And we talked about, what does it mean to be intuitive? It's when you feel like you just know something, okay? And then the human events contain signs and symbols of spiritual truth. So you're going to be reading The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And this is on page 122 in your literature book, if you have a physical copy of that, or you can go to our course materials and look at the online version. It's both on page 122 there. So I want you to be thinking about what we just talked about, and you can go back in this recording and look at what we talked about with the dark romantics, and think about how Hawthorne is showing this in this story, The Birthmark. So if you have questions, make sure you show up to the live Class Connect sessions that you are invited to, or send me an email.